In October 2003, inside a genomics laboratory at the University of Puerto Rico, a geneticist named Juan Carlos Martínez Cruzado received results from a study he had spent 4 years constructing. He had collected mitochondrial DNA samples from approximately 800 Puerto Rican families, a sample size large enough to be statistically meaningful, specific enough to be precise. What he was looking for was straightforward. How much, if any, indigenous ancestry had survived in the modern Puerto Rican population? The official answer, the answer that had been in the history books since the 19th century, the answer that Spanish colonial records had established in 1565, and that subsequent historiography had treated as settled, was none. The Taino people of the Caribbean had been declared legally extinct 438 years earlier. Every mainstream account of Caribbean history proceeded from that premise. What Martínez Cruzado found in those 800 samples did not match the official answer. It did not come close to matching it. And the reason it did not match it is the dark secret that Spanish colonial administration built an entire legal system to conceal. Here's something that will change how you read the word extinct. The Taino were not a small community on the margins of colonial expansion. At contact in 1492, they numbered between 200,000 and 1 million people across Cuba, Hispaniola, Puerto Rico, Jamaica, and the Bahamas. They were the first people Christopher Columbus encountered and documented. They were the people whose canoes, agriculture, and navigation he described in more detail than any other indigenous population in his journals. The word hurricane comes from their language. The word canoe comes from their language. The word tobacco comes from their language. These are not the linguistic residue of an extinct population. They are words still in daily use by people who have no idea they are speaking Taino. Spanish colonial records from 1514, 22 years after contact, showed fewer than 28,000 Taino surviving on Hispaniola alone, from a pre-contact population that historians now estimate at between 300,000 and 1 million. What produced that specific mortality pattern in that specific time frame was not random. And to understand what Martínez Cruzado found in those 800 DNA samples, you need to understand what produced it. Not the official explanation, the mechanism behind the official explanation. I want to start with where the Taino came from, because the answer is not what most people expect. And because understanding the origin makes the erasure that followed considerably harder to justify by any framework. The Taino did not originate in the Caribbean. The 2020 Nature study led by David Reich's laboratory at Harvard, one of the most comprehensive ancient DNA analyses of Caribbean populations ever conducted, traced indigenous Caribbean ancestry to migrations from the Amazon basin approximately 8,000 years ago. The specific maternal haplogroups that appear in pre-contact Taino skeletal remains, A2 and C1, connect to populations in present-day Venezuela and Colombia. The Caribbean was not populated by people who wandered accidentally from a nearby island. It was populated by people who paddled open ocean canoes from the South American mainland in organized waves over thousands of years. The Taino were the last and largest of those waves, and by the time Columbus arrived, they had been building civilization on these islands for at least 2,000 years. The Saladoid ceramic tradition tracks the movement of the Taino's Amazonian ancestors island by island northward, through the Caribbean over those 2,000 years. Each island shows the same ceramic sequence arriving at a datable moment. It is a migration mapped in clay, one of the most precisely documented population movements in the entire archaeological record of the Americas. These were not people without history. They were people whose history had been documented in the earth before any European ship appeared on the horizon. By 1492, they had built an agricultural economy, a political structure of regional chieftains called caciques, a cosmological system, a ceremonial practice, and a population large enough to sustain all of it across 5 major island groups simultaneously. And then, within 22 years of European contact, over 80% of them were dead. I want to be precise about what produced that, because the word disease, while accurate, conceals the mechanism, and the word warfare, while also accurate, conceals the instrument. The mechanism had a specific name, and it is the name that the dark secret behind the Taino's genetic origins is built around. The Encomienda was a Spanish colonial labor assignment system that allocated Taino communities to Spanish colonizers as legally bound labor units. The Encomienda holder was technically required to provide Christian instruction and basic welfare to the assigned laborers. In practice, it was a system for extracting maximum output from a population that colonial law classified as legally inferior. Gold mining operations ran continuously. Rest periods were minimal or non-existent. Modern historians examining the mortality records now estimate that Encomienda assigned populations experienced death rates of 60 to 80% within 5 years of assignment. This was not incidental. The mathematics of the Encomienda were understood by the Spanish administrators who designed and extended it. Las Casas, the Dominican friar who became the most prominent critic of the system, documented the conditions in writing that colonial authorities repeatedly attempted to suppress. He wrote of villages depopulated within months. He wrote of communities assigned to mines and coastal pearl fisheries who simply ceased to exist as functioning units before the first year of assignment was complete. His accounts were accurate. The mortality records corroborate them. What the Encomienda did to the Taino male population in particular was irreversible within a generation. Mining and heavy labor operations killed men at rates that made population replacement impossible. Within 2 decades, there were not enough Taino men surviving to sustain demographic continuity. The Spanish response to the resulting labor shortage was to import enslaved West Africans, which is why modern Puerto Rican, Cuban, and Dominican DNA shows 3-way admixture, rather than simple indigenous European mixing. But the Taino maternal lines were already being driven toward functional extinction through a mechanism that operated separately from the labor system. And that mechanism was not disease or warfare. It was a legal document. In 1565, Spanish colonial authorities officially classified the Taino as extinct. This is the sentence most Caribbean history courses teach as a factual demographic statement. It was not. It was a legal instrument. Living Taino individuals held land claims under certain provisions of Spanish colonial law. A legally recognized indigenous population had rights, however limited, that a legally extinct population did not. The Declaration of Extinction was issued not because the Taino had ceased to exist, but because declaring them extinct resolved an administrative problem. Land that had been promised to surviving Taino families could not be appropriated as long as those families had legal standing. Remove the legal standing and the land question resolved itself. The women who continued to exist, who continued to bear children, to transmit their maternal DNA to those children, to carry forward the specific haplogroup signatures that their ancestors had brought from the Amazon basin 8,000 years earlier, were reclassified. The census stopped counting them as Taino. They became mestiza. The category absorbed them. The legal identity was erased. The biological reality was not. I kept returning to that distinction while I was researching this. The Spanish census stopped counting these women as Taino in the same year it declared the Taino extinct. The women were still in the census. They were simply in a different column. The document said one thing. The genome was recording something else entirely. This is where Martínez Cruzado's 800 families return to the center of the story. His 2003 mitochondrial DNA study found that 61% of modern Puerto Ricans carry indigenous maternal haplogroups, specifically A2 and C1. The same haplogroups documented in pre-contact Taino skeletal remains from archaeological sites across the Caribbean. Not a marginal residual percentage, not a trace too faint to interpret confidently. 61% of a population that had been officially extinct for 400 years was carrying the maternal DNA of the people Spain had declared legally non-existent 4 centuries earlier. The maternal line passes from mother to child regardless of who the father is. Through 400 years of Spanish colonial rule, through the introduction of enslaved African populations, through the sustained demographic pressure of a colonial system designed to erase indigenous identity, the women who carried Taino maternal haplogroups kept transmitting them. The Spanish census had reclassified those women. Colonial law had declared their ancestors extinct. None of that affected the mechanism by which mitochondrial DNA moves from one generation to the next. The genome does not read colonial legislation. It does not respond to administrative reclassification. It does not disappear from the record because a census clerk stopped writing a particular word in a particular column. The 61% figure changed the public conversation about Taino survival, but it was still a modern sample. The harder scientific question was whether those maternal haplogroups in living Puerto Ricans represented genuine continuity from pre-contact Taino ancestors, or whether they could be explained by post-contact mixing with other indigenous groups arriving in the Caribbean after 1492. Answering that question required sequencing people who had died before Columbus arrived. And in 2020, that is exactly what happened. The Nature study published in 2020 by David Reich's team analyzed 49 complete genomes extracted from pre-contact Caribbean individuals, people who died in archaeological sites across Cuba, the Bahamas, Puerto Rico, and Hispaniola, all radiocarbon dated to before European contact. The specific maternal haplogroups in those ancient genomes matched with precision the haplogroups Martínez Cruzado had identified in modern Puerto Rican families 17 years earlier. The match was not approximate. The genetic continuity was direct. The indigenous ancestry in living Caribbean populations does not come from post-contact mixing with other indigenous groups. It traces to the Taino themselves, carried through maternal lines that survived the Encomienda, survived the legal Extinction Declaration, survived 4 centuries of colonial administrative pressure, and arrived intact in the DNA of people who were told, and in many cases believed, that they had no indigenous ancestry at all. The history books were recording one story. The genome was recording a different one. The genome was correct. There is a geographic dimension to the survival that the genetic data makes visible. Modern studies show significantly higher indigenous ancestry percentages in the Jibaro communities of Puerto Rico's central mountain interior compared to the coastal urban populations where Spanish colonial administration was most concentrated. The mountain geography that made those highland communities hardest for the colonial system to fully reach and control is the same geography where the Taino maternal line was most completely preserved. Colonial administrative reach and genetic survival are inversely mapped against each other. The communities at the furthest edge of the colonial system's functional authority are the communities carrying the highest percentages of pre-contact ancestry. That correlation is not incidental. It is the imprint of a survival strategy that operated without conscious coordination, simply by remaining in terrain that the system found difficult to administer. The United Confederation of Taino People now holds United Nations NGO status and represents tens of thousands of identity claimants across Puerto Rico, Cuba, the Dominican Republic, and the diaspora communities in New York, Florida, and across the continental United States. The DNA has given the Reclamation movement a biological foundation that no historical argument alone could have provided. The ancient genomes say what the Colonial Records spent 4 centuries denying. The Taino were never extinct. They were legally reclassified, administratively absorbed, and rendered invisible in the official record. Their biology continued regardless. But the Reclamation also generates a question the DNA cannot answer and the science does not resolve. What is the relationship between genetic descent and cultural identity when the language has been gone for generations, when the original religion was forcibly replaced by a colonial Christianity, when the material culture was systematically destroyed, when the knowledge systems were broken and the oral traditions were interrupted? The genome proves continuity. It does not restore what continuity without protection loses. These are questions the DNA opens and leaves open. They are also the questions that the people now carrying those 61% results are asking in real time, with no institutional framework equipped to help them answer. If this reached you, if you carry Caribbean ancestry and opened a DNA result with a percentage that your family story never prepared you for, or if the distance between what the history book said happened to the Taino and what the genetic record actually shows made you sit with something that needed a name, leave it in the comments. Send this to someone carrying that ancestry without an explanation attached to it. Subscribe if you want to keep following what these records contain. The Colonial Archive closed the file on the Taino in 1565. The genome never did. I am nowhere near the end of what it is still holding. Thanks for watching.